Hello and a very warm welcome to the Telegraph Book Club's May event with the wonderful Alison Weir here talking about her latest book, Henry VIII, The Heart and the Crown. Here's my beloved copy here. We're going to have a great evening, an hour conversation, including a lot of your questions which have been pre-submitted to me. I'm so excited to hear about Alison, about the book, and all about these really fantastic questions you've submitted to me. I'm Kate Williams. I'm a professor of history, author of 10 historical books, most recently on Mary Queen of Scots, broadcaster, CNN's royal historian and friend of Alison's. So it's wonderful to be here with you and be with all of you as well. So if you can make the video full screen by clicking on the square on the bottom right hand corner, but if you're having any problems with the connection or the visuals, do email extra@telegraph.co.uk and they are there to help you. So we can't take any questions now, we've already taken them, but any problems, housekeeping problems, just drop them a line. So I'm thrilled to be here with Alison. She is a Sunday Times, New York Times world bestseller. She's published more than 30 books, absolutely incredible, 30 books, including the Tudor Rose trilogy, about 3 generations of history's most iconic family, the Tudors, and the wildly acclaimed 6 Tudor Wives, all of which were Sunday Times bestsellers. Alison's sold all over the world, huge translations into all over the world, and these amazing books that she writes, and there's the detail that she has in the books is something I really love. I love Alison's detail, I love the involvement, I love her passion. I've spoken with Alison on a lot of occasions, and the passion she has for history, Tudor history, women's history, and the real behind closed doors of what happens is so exciting. So let's go. I've got loads of questions, and I'm going to start with a few of mine. So this is a pretty big book, Alison.
It is.
Quite a lot of words.
It is.
And so you start with him as a child, missing his mother, and we take him to the end of his life. So you pretty much go from cradle to grave. You really do show a huge amount of life. I mean, a lot of stuff happened in Henry VIII's life. It wasn't one where he was just sitting around in Hampton Court saying, what shall I do next? He was a pretty busy guy.
Exactly, and it was very hard, Kate, to choose the themes for the book from the so many storylines I could have gone for. And also there's a cast of hundreds, many of them historical titans, and no pressure there, basically. And also to live up to Henry VIII. What a challenge to write a novel about one of history's most iconic figures, and to do it from his point of view solely. Because having written the 6 Tudor Queens series, each book solely from each of his queens' point of view, I did think Henry should have his say, and thankfully my publishers agreed.
It's very interesting because, as you say, there's a huge cast of characters, and that must be quite difficult because there are so many characters that go in and out. Because in a real life, we have so many people who move in and out of our lives, but in a novel, we need a bit more consistency. So it must have been difficult to work out which characters to cut out.
Yes, it was. I mean, as I said, there were so many storylines I could have developed, and I chose the characters who would move Henry's story along, who were important in his life, and who also helped to reveal various aspects of his character.
Because otherwise, you could just have random ladies-in-waiting, random courtiers. There's so many different people.
You could, and even if you have one mention of someone, you've got to give them some context. And then again, you might get your editor saying, "Could we have more?" And the problem is length. There are constraints on length, particularly in America. They're very forgiving here. But as you can see, it turned out to be a very big book. I was quite shocked when I saw it, actually. I didn't realise it's a doorstop.
It'll be good. I'm good. Like 25 hours of audiobook is here. I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I presume will be read by Henry VIII himself. And so obviously you were saying that he's having his say, and it's fascinating to hear his relation to his parents, because somehow I never think of Henry VIII as a child. I always think of himself as a grown adult.
Well, having written a biography and a novel about Elizabeth of York, the novel is the first book in the Tudor Rose trilogy, and she was Henry's mother. She died in 1503 when he was 11, not 12, and I think he mourned her so sincerely. He was too young to see her as a human being with flaws. He idealised her. She was the perfect medieval queen. And I think she became the benchmark against which he judged his wives.
Interesting. Yes, you definitely show him as really idealising her. When they say Henry, be rejoiced because she's gone. He said, I can't because I need her. I want my mother.
Yes, he did. And we know that. There's a beautiful illumination in the Vox Passionale, a manuscript recently discovered, now in the National Library of Wales. And it shows this little boy in a green tunic with his head in his hands, his little red head in his hands, kneeling, weeping against a black draped mourning bed. That's his mother's mourning bed. It brings it home vividly how Henry mourned of his mother.
So you have a lot of the politics, you have a lot of the, international situation, but what you really, I think, what we have a lot of here are Henry's feelings, Henry's innermost thoughts. And was that hard to show him as a human, as a person with heart, as you say, the heart and the crown, to kind of get into Henry's heart?
Yes, because his heart often ruled his head and clashed with the political man. And I wanted to show that side of him. He was an old romantic. He was a sentimentalist as well. And he could be very sanctimonious as he got older. And I just wanted to portray Henry as a rounded human being, not the caricature we have from Charles Lawton, changing wives and chopping off heads with gleeful alacrity, throwing chicken bones over his shoulder, but a real man, a real historical personage. And I wanted to bring that to life. And there is a wealth of documentation about him, many, many letters. We have insights into his mind and his character and his opinions and his emotions.
What a quote I liked was Wolsey saying that Hampton Court would be a palace of illusions. And I really like the way in which you show place here, Henry's chief palaces. I mean, it's so sad to me that we don't have Greenwich Palace anymore. Yeah, thanks Charles II for knocking that down. Very helpful.
Absolutely.
Yes, I would so love to have that. And obviously we are eternally grateful that William and Mary ran out of money and had to keep the Henry VIII bit of Hampton Court, otherwise we'd have lost that.
But damn Barbara Castlemaine for knocking down nonsuch.
Knocking them all down. You're like, boring old Tudor palaces, get rid of this. So, but how did you bring about this sense of place and sense of the different palaces? Because that is something that's quite alien to us about the Tudor court, how much they're constantly on the move between palaces.
And that's something you've got to get across seamlessly. And I'm fortunate, I've done so much research on the palaces and the residences, and have visited as many as I can of those that survive. And we've got a lot of description, we've got a lot of detailing, and just a few details can actually convey a place. And that I found was a very interesting aspect to the book. I didn't want it to read like a travelogue, though. It has to be, got across to the reader seamlessly.
And what is how do you feel about historical detail? Because, it's a difficult balance, I find, as having written historical novels myself, between all the detail that you want to use to build up that world, but also not overloading the story with detail.
It's true, and I have read historical novels, not your good self, because they're wonderful, but I have read historical novels where you are bogged down by detail, and I think it's a question of getting the detail right. And I think people love the detail. Sometimes it's in the detail we see the wider picture, and I think that's very important.
Because it's difficult, isn't it? Because, obviously, when I go into a restaurant, I don't note every tiny thing. And when Henry would go into a banqueting hall, he wouldn't note every tiny thing. So how do we convey that? And yet, how do we convey what it looks like, but yet
it's what
show
makes
the
an
familiarity
impression on you? And that's the sort of thing I want to bring. If you walked into the Great Hall at Hampton Court, you would be overawed. And that's what it was built for. And that's the kind of impression I want to get. I want to get across how it would have come across to people in those days.
So obviously Henry VIII was a man of many palaces. I mean,
about 70.
Yes, many palaces. Some taken from chums like Wolsey, and some obviously from the monasteries. So
yes.
But you focus mainly on the key palaces here. We don't want to go wandering around all the extra ones.
Again, I had to. It's a question of length. It's a question of focusing on what's really important. There were loads of houses I would have liked to include, and some of them are included in the 6 Tudor Queen series. But I had to be careful, because there were so many important things, more important things,
and you'd
to
have
get
to
into
introduce
the book.
each one.
And you would, absolutely.
So I'm just thinking. I mean, it's very interesting, with the wives. So Anne Boleyn, I've just got the section here on page 248 and 249 of Anne Boleyn meeting Henry VIII, and he became aware of a pair of dark eyes regarding him boldly and held their gaze. It was Anne Boleyn, back at court after her brief spell of disgrace, and where until now he would not have seen anything remarkable in that narrow face and sallow skin, it struck him that here was beauty beyond the ordinary. It was in her eyes, her slender form, her French mannerisms. her smiling lips. In that moment he was struck by Cupid's dart of love, but it was more like a thunderbolt. This is the end of 249, so that's what I call a cliffhanger. It was more than a thunderbolt. So, and he's just seen Anne Boleyn playing ball with some other ladies. So obviously there were all these different questions of how Henry saw Anne Boleyn, how he fell in love with Anne Boleyn. Why did you choose him wandering around outside and seeing a ball game?
I wanted him to be able to observe her, and I wanted to show some movement in the story, and what she might be doing in her leisure time. And I also had to keep to what I'd done in the Six Tudor Queens series. I had to reconcile the book so that all the details married up. In one or two places they didn't, because a little bit of new research threw something out. But no, I just wanted to portray an everyday scene that to Henry seemed special.
It's interesting, isn't it? I like the idea that Anne Boleyn, almost kind of hooked Henry with her fantastic netball skills. This.
I wouldn't say with netball. I'm probably just tossing a ball around.
But
absolutely.
Still, they will be the same sort of skills that we need to get to be the goal attack on the netball skills now.
The graceful movement,
because some say
figure.
It was seeing her in a dance, it was seeing her in a mask, but you feel it wasn't a dance, it wasn't a mask, it was probably something a very ordinary moment in court where suddenly he thought, my gosh, that girl I've always been looking at and paid no attention to, suddenly he thought, heavens.
Well, I wanted to do something different from a mask because there's that pivotal moment when she makes her debut at the court at York Place in 1522, when she takes part in a mask.
So that's too repetitive.
I wanted to do something. Yes, I wanted to do. I've written about that so often, and I wanted to do something different. I used my imagination.
I mean, we don't know for sure, so this seems just as likely.
No, we don't. There are so many things we don't know, and that's where a novelist's creative ability comes in.
I like the idea that they met at a very small moment rather than a big giant mask. It's a small, intimate, domestic moment. I found that very touching.
I mean, he would have seen her before. She was at court. She served Catherine of Aragon. He would have seen her whenever he visited the Queen's chamber before she was sent home in disgrace, and probably afterwards. But maybe this is the first time he's actually really looked at her.
And thought, here comes Cupid's bolt.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's interesting because you draw a sort of parallel. Just a few pages before, we have this collapse of the emperor's engagement to Princess Mary. He said he goes for the beautiful Isabella of Portugal, who also has a dowry of nearly 1 million ducats. You don't want to turn that down.
No, you don't.
So you sort of draw this parallel between the collapse of Mary's engagement and suddenly he then spots Anne Boleyn.
Yes. I know, and it's the end of one era almost, and the end of the Spanish dominance era, and the beginning of another, which is Anne, also plus Henry's leaning towards the French, and Anne favoured the French. You have French ways, and it's this sort of demarcation line. So it's 1525 to 6.
The end of the Spanish alliance, and that really was marked.
Yes, it was.
So it was a really cataclysmic thing to him that his daughter was not going to be engaged to the emperor. That was very bruising to him.
He was furious, absolutely furious. And then, of course, he looks to Spain. England is always keeping the balance of power between Spain and the Empire and France. And if you're not allied with one, you ally yourself with the other. Because England is a smaller nation; it needs a big ally.
Yes, I thought it was so interesting because obviously I'd like to see it was all just him happening to just happened to see Anne Boleyn and thought she was marvellous, but you draw this kind of key, it's interwoven with politics. Yes, she looks marvellous throwing the ball around, but also he really was moving away from the Spanish alliance.
Well, he was. I mean, by this time, Catherine of Aragon is past the ways of women, we are told. She cannot bear him any more children. The Spanish alliance has outlived its usefulness. Catherine is redundant, basically. And while I'm sure Henry did retain some love for her, but I don't think it was ever a grand passion in the way it was for Anne Boleyn. I think it was a chivalrous love. He was the knight-errant who rescued her from penury. He strayed during her first pregnancy, and the marriage had been sort of, interspersed with infidelities. But they had a lot in common. But I mean, he loved her. She was older than him. She was 5.5 years older. I think that had started to really show at this point. And I mean, the King of France said that the King of England's wife is old and ugly, which is not very nice, of course. But
with an A, that's how we get judged.
May I should think.
So obviously we chart his passion for Anne, but when they do finally get together, you see it from his point of view.
yeah.
He's terribly disappointed.
It's a disappointment.
The
All cats are grey in the dark.
The final romance scene is the fireworks don't go off, do they?
No, they don't. And that's how I did that in reverse, because it was written in the Anne Boleyn novel. And how she feels, she's like, she can't understand it. You know, he's up and off.
Yeah.
And
bit quick.
I know, but yeah. Well, no. I meant after the night, he leaves. He's got something to do politically. She feels a bit deflated, as you can imagine. And then I had to write it in reverse from Henry's point of view. And you find out what he's really thinking.
He was a bit disappointed.
Well, it was. I mean, I think he'd been building this up in his mind for years into something that's going to be, explosively wonderful.
He'd been waiting for all these years.
The consummation is going to be the ultimate goal. And basically, it's another woman in a bed. You know, and I think already by then, he's gone so far with Anne Boleyn, he cannot pull out now. And I think he felt that, he must continue with this. But I think already the cracks are beginning to show. And
Wolsey, he has a key role here. And I really like the way you humanise him as well. So, we've got our major ministers that we have that are Wolsey and Cromwell.
Yeah.
And how do we draw a distinction between Wolsey and Cromwell, who are both both in the end are having to do what Henry VIII's bidding and both get executed?
They do, absolutely. Well, Wolsey doesn't. We don't know. It's debatable.
Wolsey dies on the way, but he was going to have his head chopped off, wasn't he?
Well, I'm not sure, because this is before Henry began executing people in holy orders.
But
that wasn't until 1534. It was
handy that he died.
I think, yes, it was. I don't know what would have happened to Wolsey, whether Henry would have gone so far, and he did regret what happened to Wolsey, definitely. But, you've got so many different... Wolsey represents the old order, Catholicism, pre-Reformation England. Cromwell is the new guy on the scene, and he is the one he's the reformist, an ardent reformist, and both of them great administrators. But Cromwell, I think, far more rough and ready than Wolsey, far more ruthless, definitely far more ruthless. And so they are, they are very disparate characters, but both very able.
And so... I think what you showed me well is, when Henry VIII goes to Catherine of Aragon's apartment in the hope of seeing Anne, you really show us the fact that there aren't any women at court apart from ladies in waiting. So if you're a king and you fancy having a bit of, wandering eye, it's pretty much got to be your wife's lady in waiting.
It could be. There were courtiers were allowed to bring their wives to live at court with them. And these ladies could be called upon as temporary extra ladies in waiting to the Queen. So there were other women at court, but only if there was a Queen. If there was no Queen, they couldn't bring their wives.
No Queen, they couldn't
and
bring
so
them.
there are only two women. There's the laundress, the King's laundress, and the wife who makes the King's puddings. And I doubt he fancied either of those.
Good to have a pudding. As a Queen, you need to have beautiful ladies around you to show your presence. It's important to have beautiful aristocratic young ladies around you. But
it shows up when you're getting older, as poor Catherine of Aragon did, and faded. To have young ladies, who are going to show that up and make it a contrast is probably quite painful.
And Catherine Howard, when we talk about Catherine Howard, wife number 5, who who it's sometimes said that he staged the recognition of her adultery in Hampton Court. But in here, he just finds a letter and he didn't know about it.
Oh, he's bounced into it, just as he was bounced into the situation with the charges against Anne Boleyn.
So you feel he was bounced into...
Oh, I think he was. I think his behaviour is that of a man...
both wives.
I think it's his behaviour in both cases is that of a man who's completely shocked. And he does exactly the same thing when he's first given evidence, like the letter from Cranmer, which is left in his pew. And he's first given evidence and he's sceptical. And he says, go away, this isn't enough. I'm not going to believe this. You'll need to find more than this. And in both cases, they lay evidence before him he cannot ignore. And whether it's true or not is another matter. But as far as Henry's concerned, this is a deal changer. It's cataclysmic.
So he's bounced into executing both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard.
I don't think he wanted to execute Catherine Howard. And I couldn't bring that out in the Catherine Howard novel. There is a report that he was going to keep her in Fontainebleau in France, that he was going to keep her in prison for the rest of her life. The Spanish ambassador, Chapuis, thought he might divorce her. But he was. The thing is that Catherine Howard represented the Catholic faction at court, and by then Henry's court is strictly divided by warring factions, and it was the reformists, some secret Protestants, who actually were on the council at the time. Henry was away on progress. He had the council with him. The more radical members of the council were the ones at Hampton Court who brought her down, and certainly made it difficult for Henry to go any other way than to order her execution.
So you really, so you feel that he was really pushed into it?
Oh, I think he was, yes, absolutely. And I think he was so shattered. He was in such a poor state about it. I mean, it aged him overnight. He was grief-stricken, and I think that they took advantage of this.
The reformists?
Yes, I think they did. They were the hardliners, and they were out to get her down. And when she could have defended herself, she could have went there because there was. If she denied she'd ever been pre-contracted to another man. If you're pre-contracted in before this period in history, you cannot marry anyone else. It's as binding as a marriage. It has to be loosed by an ecclesiastical court, and they deliberately did not let her use that as a line of defence, that if she's pre-contracted to another man when she marries Henry, as the evidence shows, the marriage to Henry is illegal.
So the reformists wouldn't let her say that?
No, and she could not have committed adultery. Whether she actually did commit adultery is another thing. But both she and Thomas Culpeper swore independently they had not passed beyond words, and I believe that. But meeting in her privy does look a bit dodgy, and the council clearly thought so.
Do you feel sorry for her, this young girl?
I do, but I do feel sorry for what happened to her. I'm not sure about abuse. She was older than most people think. There's this. I mean, I myself have contributed to this because I've done more research since I published My Six Wives. She was not 15 when she married the king. She was older, and she seems to have been quite a bold young lady who sort of pursued men and dropped them when she'd finished with them. And so I don't see her in that way. I don't see her as a victim of abuse. And
Anne Boleyn also, he was bounced into executing. He didn't want to execute her either.
It was Cromwell who presented him with evidence he could not ignore.
So Cromwell wanted Anne down?
Yes, because it had become a vicious power struggle. It was either his head or hers. She'd already had her almoner preach a sermon on Passion Sunday to say that wicked ministers should be executed. It was a shot across the bows, and Cromwell acted very quickly.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously many of us have read the Hilary Mantel books in which it's really implied that Cromwell is the instrument of Henry VIII's desires. Cromwell is constantly trying to do what Henry VIII wants.
I think Cromwell advises Henry in a way, and Henry generally likes what Cromwell does. But I think in this case, Cromwell took a great big risk. He actually told Chapuis after Anne's execution he had thought up and plotted the affair of the Queen, in which he had taken a great deal of trouble. I don't think you can get around that. I don't think so. If Henry told him to do it, it doesn't. Henry's behaviour is not consistent with that. He's like a man who's absolutely shell-shocked.
Yeah. So he is a man. You're saying he's a romantic. He
is a romantic, yes. In some instances, yes.
He gets bound.
Yes. Not at this stage of the marriage. He's a romantic before marriage. Put it like that. It's all about courtly love.
And what about the international situation? So Henry's feelings about France and Spain change quite rapidly, don't they?
They are allies and they are rivals at the same time, especially Francis I, the King of France, because Francis is 3 years younger than Henry. Henry, from 1509, is the young, the young king in Europe. He's got everything going for him. He's magnificent. He's acclaimed, and he's so talented. He's intellectual. He gets golden opinions everywhere. And then suddenly, this younger model comes to the throne in 1515. And he's jealous. And you can see that in so many different ways. Like he even compares the calf of his leg to the King of France, and there's a lot of jealousy. But sometimes they are friendly to each other. You hear people say these kings hate each other cordially when they meet at the Field of Cloth of Gold.
Frenemies.
Yeah, frenemies. Absolutely, yes. There's a lot of rivalry between them. But Francis is you can just see it. Francis is commiserating with Henry on the fall of Anne Boleyn, and you can just sort of almost hear the slightly gleeful tone to it.
Yes. Oh dear.
Yes. I'm so sorry.
So sorry. And Henry breaks from Rome. I mean, this is a cataclysmic event for Henry, for the country, for the world. And, what do you feel were Henry's personal religious adherences?
I think Henry was a very devout Christian. He was a devout Catholic. He wrote a book in defence of the Seven Sacraments against Martin Luther, for which the Pope awarded him the title Defender of the Faith, which is still borne by the monarch today. And I think Henry felt very let down by the Pope, who denied him, or didn't deny, but just put off, granting him an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, because he needed an heir. Whether he's in love with Anne Boleyn or not, whether he wants to marry her, he desperately needs an heir.
A son.
He cannot foresee a woman ruling successfully. He sees it as unnatural for a woman to
Matilda
wield
was
dominion.
a disaster. That's what she's seen as a disaster, isn't she? She wasn't given the chance.
She is. It's not mentioned, but probably it's in the back of everyone's mind. Since the 12th century, the English have had a mental block about having a queen regnant. This, notwithstanding the fact that there are several successful female rulers, as you know, in Europe at this time. And Henry had huge respect for Margaret of Austria, for example.
And of course, Catherine of Aragon's mother,
Yes.
Isabella of Castile,
And of
for whom, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's the case that Isabella of Castile, her impact was such that the role of the queen on the chessboard changed. You could only move it one piece, and then after Isabella of Castile, there was like, well, that's not very good. So you could move the queen all over the chessboard, and she became this so powerful piece. So I mean, this ultimately powerful queen, the mother of Catherine of Aragon, that always fascinates me. This mother of Catherine of Aragon.
Too.
But Henry, he just thinks, absolutely, cannot have a queen. It's going to be a catastrophe. I'm going to be invaded by other countries.
Yeah, it's not that it would bring in foreign influence, because who does she marry?
Who does she marry?
She marry, and of course we see the problem of that with Mary the First,
and Mary Queen of Scots, poor old Mary Queen of Scots, and who she marries.
Oh gosh, yes, I know. I mean, that's a disaster right the way through. But Elizabeth solved it, of course, by not marrying at all. But it was seen as unnatural for a woman not to marry.
And then then there's all the anger against her when there is no heir. And it's only thanks to Mary Queen of Scots that there's no answer.
You can't win, can you, in that situation?
You kind of need a royal sort of a royal sort of brood stallion to pop in and then not have any ready rights over the child.
Absolutely, yes.
So Henry, you feel, was a devout Catholic, and when he dies, which you show so beautifully at the end, I don't think that's a spoiler. How do you feel he expected things to go after him? He left a male heir, and lots of new scholarship is suggesting to us that actually Edward VI. People often thought of him as a sickly child throughout his childhood, but actually arguments are that really he was fine.
He was,
and it was only really at the later end. So how do you think Henry VIII saw the future with Edward VI?
It's rather strange, actually, because the men he appointed as councillors, and he didn't want one person in charge. He wanted a regency council, call it that. And the men he appointed, many of them were ardent reformists. I mean, some of them were secret Protestants.
Yes,
and one wonders if Henry just saw the way the wind was blowing in that way. But it's hard to imagine that Henry had burned Protestants for heresy, and he burned Catholics for allegiance to the Pope. A lot of people were quite confused in the last years of his reign.
How not to get burned.
Yes, exactly. But I find it hard to accept that Henry would have authorised or sort of pointed the way to a Protestant government. Maybe he thought that the cause of reform of the church, these people would uphold his own settlement. And that's what Mary tried to fight for during Edward's reign. But as soon as Henry was dead, England became a Protestant country.
It was, I mean, his arrangements. I'm always so fascinated by the fact that Henry VIII left these plans for this huge tomb, the sort of biggest tomb we might possibly see.
It was never done.
And now all he has is this tiny little square put down by William IV in St George's Chapel. He wanted a huge tomb, didn't get it finished, and in the end, he borrowed Wolsey's Cathedral, and then it ended up with Nelson. So he wanted a huge tomb, but he also left, I don't know what you feel, Alison, I feel he left quite strong instructions of what to be done for Edward VI's regency, but they were almost immediately overridden.
They were.
Do you think it was he could have left them in a different way, or it was inevitable? I mean, I just wonder how I'm interested that he had lived through this backbiting court in which everyone is killing each other for power, and then that's immediately that's what starts when Edward VI dies. Could he have stopped that from happening?
I think I think there wasn't a viable opposition party because there had been Catholic and reformist or secret Protestant factions at court for some years, and the Catholic faction had been muzzled because the Howards, the leading nobles, the Duke of Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, had been clapped in the Tower. Surrey had been executed right at the end of Henry VIII's reign. Henry did not sign Norfolk's death warrant, and Norfolk's stay was Premier Catholic peer, stayed in the Tower for Edward's reign, was only released by Mary. And then Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, hardline Catholic bishop, he'd fallen foul of Henry, fallen out of favour. So there was nobody really strong enough on the other side
to oppose.
And so Henry's looking for men of ability, and there's no doubt that, you know, some of these people he advanced were men of ability.
The Seymours.
Cranmer he trusted, yes.
Yeah.
The Seymours, of course, were natural counsellors because they're Edward's uncles. And there are others, you know, so Henry probably thinks he can entrust the government to them. But of course, Edward Seymour makes a bid and becomes, you know, he becomes the Lord Protector.
And then you have Thomas Seymour doing the most random things, trying to kidnap
absolutely.
Edward VI and shooting his dog.
Absolutely, and marrying the Queen Dowager with indecent haste, yes.
So there probably wasn't a way of making, of stopping that sort of
Henry didn't
massive
trust
battle
Thomas
for power
Seymour, yeah.
before happening. Fascinating. So I've got all these amazing questions,
Wow.
and these are absolutely brilliant questions from the readers. They're really exciting. So I'm just going to try and get through as many as we can. I know
Let's go.
Alison said you're a fast lady,
Okay,
so you're an Olympic question answerer, you said to me.
Fire away.
So Lee says, everyone thinks they know Henry VIII. How do you avoid the myth and create a real person?
Because you look at this, you look at primary sources extensively. You look at Henry's letters, you look at the state papers, you look at as much as you can, and I've done that over decades.
So that's how you avoid. And
You
what do you think are the prevailing myths that we have around Henry VIII?
The prevailing business I said earlier was Charles Lawton. You know, this man changing wives and chopping off heads with gleeful alacrity. He's a monster. And that there isn't a humane man in there.
So you're showing the humane man.
I'm trying to show him as a rounded human being. I'm not saying he wasn't a monster in some respect.
And I mean, obviously, you know, as you say, you know, plenty of people were burned and persecuted
They were.
and
Yes,
executed.
they were. But that was the law.
And,
he acted within the law. He was not a tyrant per se. He acted within the law.
Can we what about Lady Rochford? You know, with
well, yes,
with
because
Catherine
he had an
Catherine-
Act of Parliament passed so that he could execute an insane person.
This is Catherine Howard's
Yes.
Lady in Waiting.
Yeah, she acted as sort of a go-between.
A go-between, and she'd been obviously the poor.
Yeah.
She'd also seen her husband.
Yes,
executed.
she had, and she'd been looked after for that.
And she's Catherine Howard's Lady in Waiting, and then she's accused of being a go-between. Yes, and so
yes, she is.
and she goes
it's misprision
mad.
Of treason,
and she goes mad, and then but there is a law saying you can't execute a mad person. And Henry changes that.
Yes, he does. So
Can
he's
we-
acting strictly speaking within the law.
Yes. Do you?
Yep.
Is that it?
Because
can
and I think that
be aimed a bit more
I think-
towards the bad side?
I think, well, yes, I mean it is, but I think at the time, given how treason was viewed as such the most heinous crime, and how kingship was viewed, I think most people would have endorsed that because her behaviour was, as far as most people are concerned, totally reprehensible.
Lady Rochford's for,
Yes,
for allowing
yes, it
this
was,
to happen.
Yes,
And,
for actually actively encouraging it.
And Jackie says lots of books about Henry VIII. What is the fresh perspective you're going for here?
Because I don't think any of them are written entirely from Henry's point of view. Correct me if I'm wrong, but no, I mean, having written all these 6 novels about his wives, each from their point of view, it was time to look at the subject from Henry's viewpoint.
And John asks, and we have a similar question from Daniel. John says, how can we be sure that the jousting accident was the turning point in Henry's character? And Daniel asks a similar question about the jousting accident. How this impact of the jousting.
It wasn't, basically.
Daniel says, how much did Henry VIII's jousting accident in 1536 affect his health and temper? So you're saying not that much?
Not at all. Because the source that gives the evidence
The
that he was
jousting
accident. He had a fall from his horse in January 1536, and the papal nuncio in Paris, Rodolfo Pio, Bishop of Faenza, stated that he was out cold for 2 hours without speaking. And there's been this theory evolved from this that he had brain damage and that he changed character suddenly. Rodolfo Pio is one of the most unreliable of observers. His account of the fall of Anne Boleyn 4 months later is littered with errors, and I wouldn't rely on anything he said. Moreover, someone on the spot, Chapuis, another English observer, said he fell very so heavily, but it was a miracle he wasn't injured, but he took no harm. And so there's no sudden change in character. You can see the trajectory of Henry's frustration, getting the better of him over the years, and he starts to, you know, blood is spilled in the so-called Great Matter in 1534. This is in advance of January 1536. There's no sudden change in Henry, it's a progression, and if you study the whole reign you can see that.
So there's obviously no kind of, you know, so do you feel it kind of brings him into kind of confront his mortality? The fact that it does hit his head.
Yes, I think it does, absolutely. I think it brings home to him the fact that you know, he needs a son, and Anne Boleyn at the time is pregnant and she loses a son at 15 weeks pregnant. If they could have told, but they seem to have, you know.
Yes, it's fascinating that
I know
they
it
seem
is.
to know.
I'm not sure they would know, but it
without
says
scans,
a fetus of 15 weeks growth. That's what it's described as.
Yes,
and then all sorts of theories have come out that there was something deformed about it, but there's no one historical source to support that theory.
I don't know how they'd know at 15 weeks as well.
I'm not sure either. No, was it somebody? Was it Chapuis just being a bit malicious? Well, I wonder.
It's fascinating what you're saying about sources, because we are quite dependent on the ambassadors who are watching.
We
are, and you know, watching the court, and they can be a bit biased.
But he's biased, but he names his sources, and you can work out when Henry says he's been seduced into this marriage with Anne Boleyn by sortileges or sorcery. We know from Chapuis got the information fourth hand, and it's from a hostile source, so we can discount it.
Interesting, isn't it? And I always find it fascinating that, you know, having just watched the coronation, that the St Edward's crown, that Anne Boleyn wore St Edward's crown when she was crowned as a consort. I think partly to legitimise her, but also to imply, you know, this is a boy in her stomach, but it wasn't. No,
it wasn't. And then it might be, listeners may be interested to know that there may well be some elements of that crown Anne Boleyn wore in the crown that is now St Edward's crown today, because although it's often said that there was a new crown made, there is evidence that some of the old crown was used for it.
Were kept. Some of the bits. Someone was like, it's like the coronation. I always think the coronation spoon was kept because someone thought, that could be useful for my porridge. I'll keep that. Maybe some few little bits and pieces were held back. It's like the Bayeux tapestry that was just kind of abandoned. And I think someone found the Bayeux tapestry kind of covering over some stuff and thought, I'll look after that.
The last bit's missing.
Some people, indeed, which I'm sure is Bishop Odo popping up and doing his thing, but crowning William the Conqueror. That's what I think. So you see, I'm sure someone caught some bits and pieces and perhaps put them in there. Yeah, put them in the store for later.
Could be.
You never know.
You don't know.
You never put them on the historical eBay. Penny's asking here, you know, she said, I'm always impressed by the research you put into your characters. How do you research historical characters in such detail?
You look at as many sources as you can. I mean, I've done that over decades. All the Tudor books I've written, there are extensive bibliographies, so you only need to look at one or two of those to see how many sources you need to look at to get to know these people as far as we can get to know anyone who lived 500 years ago.
What Richard says, was Henry VIII the worst king? If not, who was?
Well, I wouldn't say Henry VIII was the worst king. I mean, he ended his reign he started his reign in a medieval kingdom. He ended it in a modern state, and some would applaud him for that. But I would say Edward II, probably one of the worst kings ever. Bad king, and George IV. George IV, yes. Yeah. Edward II didn't want to rule.
No.
He wanted to do gardening and digging and things like that, you know.
And George IV just wanted to hang out with the ladies.
George IV just was a total spendthrift.
And divorce his wife.
Yes.
Try and get rid of his wife.
Shut his wife out of the coronation.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So they're the worst kings. Henry VIII. Where do we put him? Where do we put him on the king graph?
I wouldn't know. I'd say 2/3 along. I would say there's a lot that, you know, we can thank Henry for. Depends on our religious viewpoint, of course. If you're Catholic, you would have a far dimmer view of Henry than someone who was Protestant.
And what's the most surprising fact, says Sinead, that you discovered about Henry VIII in your research?
Oh my goodness, now you've bounced it on me. That I think, well, there are so many actually, but two that come to mind is that I think that he was almost certainly the father of Mary Boleyn's daughter, Catherine Carey. But there was a legal presumption then, of course, that the husband was the father of a woman's child.
Yes.
Also, there is another that he probably was the father of Etheldred of Malt, who was brought up as I think she was brought up in a lowly position at court. But she was given incredibly greatest monastic estates.
Suspicious.
Very odd, yes.
Suspicious, yes.
There's probably a lot more if I had more time to give thought to that.
Volume 2.
Yeah.
Martin asked, is there any evidence that Henry ever regretted ridding himself of any of his wives?
Not really, no.
No.
I mean, he didn't. I mean, he obviously mourned Jane Seymour, the one he didn't rid himself of when she was taken from him. He was very grieved. But no, there is no evidence at all. Certainly, no evidence he regretted having Anne Boleyn executed or Catherine Howard.
Do we think, is it, I often think this about queens in childbirth, that they actually get almost worse served than the average woman.
They do, and there's such statistics as can be gathered show that the outcome was probably the same for women across all classes.
So
they didn't understand hygiene. This was the problem.
Because sometimes with people like, say, Princess Charlotte, daughter of George IV, they could have, they waited so long to intervene because they were terrified. They were frightened of killing of heirs to the throne. Could Jane Seymour have been saved, or not until modern medicine?
I mean, the new research I did with the help of 2 midwives and 3 doctors and a long-term ER room nurse for the Jane Seymour novel strongly suggests she died of a pulmonary embolus, and she had 2 distinct illnesses, and neither was puerperal fever. So I don't think she could have been saved. No, she couldn't. No.
And quite interesting questions about religion. So we would talk about Henry's personal thoughts about religion. We talked a bit about that. Was he a Catholic? Was he a Protestant? Or was he just Catholic? He was Catholic, and it was just. And how did Henry's daughter? So that Alison asked that question. Reuben asked, how did Henry's daughter end up ruling as a Roman Catholic? Was Henry sympathetic to Catholicism enough to let his daughter's religion slide, or is she just so stubborn?
Henry was a Catholic in his view right to the end of his life. But he was not a Roman Catholic. He'd broken with Rome. He was head of the Church of England, a Catholic church. Under his son, England turned Protestant. The king was head of a Protestant Church of England. Mary brought the English church back to Rome. She retained her Catholic faith all through Edward's reign when it was dangerous to do so. And so she had never converted at all. And so she brought England back to what she thought was the true faith. And then, of course, Elizabeth came along, and we have the Anglican settlement. England turns Protestant again, and it doesn't change back.
And it is interesting, isn't it, that obviously Edward VI was the first to have a Protestant coronation ceremony.
Yes, he was.
It's one of the key changes in the coronation ceremony.
Yep, I
know. B says, his 6 wives apart, what makes Henry VIII such a figure of such popular interest and appeal?
He's such a big king. He's a sort of iconic image of a king, and it's not just, as she says, it's not just the 6 wives. He steered England through a religious revolution. He created the most magnificent court in history. We associate him with the Renaissance concept of magnificence. He's a larger-than-life character, and there's a lot of tragedy about his life too. He starts with so much going for him, and everything seems to go downhill after a while, because had he had a son, we would have seen a very different outcome to his reign.
Had a son with Catherine of Aragon.
Yeah, if his 3 sons by Catherine of Aragon had lived, we would have seen a very different outcome. Even one, yes, absolutely.
Even one,
And that's the tragedy, Henry's tragedy.
Yes. And do you think we'd have seen a very different relationship with Spain as well?
Oh, I think we would, because it would have been a half Spanish king. I doubt we would have seen a Protestant settlement.
And because obviously, there was a rise of Protestant sentiment across Europe. How long do you think, if Henry hadn't broken from Rome to divorce, how long do you think it would have taken for England to sort of
That's very hard to predict.
Yes, I know, it's a tough question.
Yes, I know. I mean, Lutheranism is infiltrating England into the 1520s. It only began in 1517. And by 1529, we find the term Protestant being used. And I think that there would have been a movement, but whether the Crown would have, supported it at any stage, especially if there's a half Spanish king on the throne, and Spain is always aligned with the Roman Catholic Church. So I think that would have been, a given.
Interesting. Do you think, so Craig asked, do you think the loss of Catherine of Aragon and Wolsey removed restraining forces on the king? Without him, he became very much more extreme in his actions.
I think it was circumstances that made him extreme in his actions. Maybe Catherine of Aragon had acted as a brake, but her power had long gone. And Wolsey had tried to do what Henry wanted to do. Wolsey became Henry's puppet towards the end, especially in the region of the great in respect to the great matter, trying to get an annulment when he didn't want it. He wanted to see Henry married to a French princess. He liked a pro-French policy. He was very concerned. He understood that Henry's case was not a sound one, but he would not. But he did exactly what Henry wanted, and he paid the price for it.
Yeah, big price. Joanna asks, if you could go back in time, get in your time machine, what piece of advice would you give to Henry VIII?
I'd give the piece of advice his tutor did: choose a wife for yourself, marry wisely and well. Because he didn't.
So you think don't marry Catherine of Aragon in the first
place?
place?
Well, no, don't marry Catherine of Aragon. But I mean, she was older than him, and I know she was 24 when they got married. He was 18, and I don't think it was a very sensible idea to marry a woman that much older. You've got to remember, for women, life expectancy at this time is about 29 years, and given that she's starting very late, having children, it's not a good bet.
I mean, because it's interesting, isn't it? Why so many of his wives' pregnancies weren't born to term, and they were with his mistresses, but with the wives. I mean, do we think he had some kind of condition which made it?
I don't think there's enough evidence
to
suggest that. No, and also you've got to look at the history of the history of the royal of the families from which the wives came. Isabella of Castile lost children in infancy, and Anne Boleyn's mother had borne her husband every year a child, but we don't know. I mean, there don't seem to be enough for that. This is a man. Henry is a man who's fathered 15 known children at least. 7 of them boys, and some of them lived to adulthood. Elizabeth lives to 69. We can't say there's something wrong with this man.
Peter, if you were a subject at the court of King Henry VIII, who would you like to be, and would it be likely that you'd be able to keep your head?
Oh goodness, I think I'd like to be someone who kept a very low profile.
Make the king's puddings.
The wife who makes the king's puddings.
But if you got a pudding wrong, maybe you got a head chopped off.
Oh my God, no, he wasn't that axe happy. Put it like that. No, I mean he bought a house in Aldgate.
Oh, I'll be the pudding lady then.
Okay, fine. I wouldn't have minded being one of the Queen's maids of honour.
So which queen would you be maid of honour?
Which queen would I know? Well, probably Catherine of Aragon.
So would you be a maid of honour and then make a good marriage to an aristocrat and then go off and live in the country, a long way from court?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. I certainly wouldn't want to get into the king's path and have his eye alight on me.
How, if you did, can you kind of get rid of, what can you do if you're a lady in waiting and the king thinks you look good?
Anne Boleyn did. She resisted him to begin with.
Do you think I don't think she kind of resisted him, but also gave him a tiny bit of hope?
Oh, she did. She played the game.
If you really, really say, I really don't want to get involved with the king, is it possible?
At some stage, she allowed certain favours, put it like that. We know that from the love letters. But it's quite clear that if the love letters fall into three lots, the first lot in Henry's importuning her to be his mistress in the physical sense, as we understand it. The second lot, he's begging her to be his mistress in the courtly sense, in which she will have mastery over him and there is not a physical relationship. And the third lot, he's not importuning her anymore. He's talking about he's desperate to marry her. And so Henry is holding off, and probably Anne, because they cannot risk an illicit pregnancy when Henry is proclaiming her virtue to the Pope and wants an annulment. So it's a very rather different trajectory of that Anne held Henry off for 7 years. I don't think that actually fits with the facts.
So if as a lady in waiting, it's very difficult to hold Henry off because your family are going to be saying, get the favour.
I think that's what made Anne quite neurotic over the years, because she had to keep Henry's interest while holding him off, or sharing with him in this mutual frustration, because they've agreed to wait until they marry. In fact, they consummate their relationship as soon as the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and who's opposed the annulment. And they know Thomas Cranmer's going to be coming in as Archbishop, and then the path will be clear for them. So she conceives probably before they marry.
Stephen asks, we tend to remember Henry in a fairly benign way, but in reality he was a cruel, bloody tyrant with little respect for human life. Do you think we should change the way we remember his life and reign?
I think, as I mentioned, that I've dealt with the tyranny aspect of this earlier. He was bloodthirsty in our terms, but you also have to look at it in the context of the 16th century and why he did what he did. And treason was considered such a dreadful crime, it had to be punished savagely as a deterrent to others. And one has to look at the way one looks at monarchy and the sanctity of monarchy. The king's the Lord's anointed, he's set apart from other mortals. The king can do no wrong. There's the theory is the king's law is God's law. The royal prerogative is the will of God working through the will of the king. When you look at the kingship in that respect, you can see why treason is punished so harshly.
And there's both Susan and Krista are asking, how do you not, because Henry VIII has been portrayed so many times, how do you manage to find a fresh perspective? How do you manage not, in Krista's words, not to run out of ideas? Now, I don't think you're in any danger of running out of ideas.
No,
how
in
do you
fact,
run out?
I had too many ideas and I couldn't include them all in the book. I just wanted to fictionalise the research I had done on Henry and didn't really think about it that way and thinking, well, perhaps I can bring something new to this, writing it from his point of view.
And so David's asking about Elizabeth of York. Interesting question about Elizabeth. You know, to get the crown of England, she had to marry someone, but it wouldn't have been acceptable for her to be monarch in her own right. Why was it acceptable for Mary, Elizabeth, and Jane, but not Elizabeth of York?
It was circumstances. I mean, nobody can. I mean, Richard III clearly thought that Elizabeth of York had good title to the throne. He wanted to marry her himself. And then Henry Tudor, of course, Henry VII, married her, but would not acknowledge that he owed his throne to her, although Henry VIII did acknowledge it. But no one at the time put forward an argument that Elizabeth of York should be Queen Regnant. But when come to the end of Edward's reign, when Henry VIII, Edward's sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, have been restored to the succession but are still deemed illegitimate. And then Edward wants to maintain the Protestant settlement, but he knows that if Mary comes to the throne, she is going to restore Catholicism. It's the lesser of two evils. So he disinherits both of his sisters and names and Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, as heiress, because she's a stout Protestant. And that's how England came to have a female ruler. Although Jane was young, she was married to Northumberland. He was Lord President of the Council. He was ruling England in Edward's name. She was married to Northumberland's son, and it looked as if Northumberland was going to treat her as a puppet and rule through her.
And you know, when Edward tried to say, "I wanted to be Jane," there was quite a lot of shock, wasn't there? Quite a lot of people tried to.
Nobody knew her.
Quite a lot of people just tried to discourage him, didn't they? They said, you know, a lot of very powerful courtiers. I don't know about this.
It was a bit of a done deal, though, and they all went along with it. And as soon as Mary came to the throne,
like,
tired of popular acclaim.
Yeah.
A lot of backtracking. She couldn't execute the lot of them, so she had to work with them. They got away with it, you know.
Yeah. Yes, you know. Yes, you are the Blood Queen after all, and you're actually very popular.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And because she was seemed for legitimacy, and that's why the country rallied to her. And it didn't matter that she was a woman. She was Henry's daughter, and Henry is still held in great esteem by his former subjects.
And there is, which obviously Elizabeth I, she keeps flagging that up, doesn't she?
She does, yes. She's the lion's cub.
She's the lion's cub.
And all his children revered him.
Makes her look a bit more like him. And,
yes.
You know, and, you know, is there, I mean, you know, not to do too much what if, but if Jane Seymour had been John Seymour, would it have been more of a battle for Mary to get the throne because it would have been a woman against a male monarch?
You mean, sorry, Jane Seymour?
If Jane Seymour had been a male, would there have been more support?
Henry wouldn't have married her. Do you think Jane Grey?
No, sorry, Jane Grey.
Sorry. Yeah, Jane Grey, yeah.
That's a whole unique aspect.
Yes, I was thinking that, yeah. No, if Jane Grey had been a male, I still don't think I still think that the country would have rallied to Mary.
That Mary, as the daughter, would the legitimate, the blood, because the British monarchy works on blood legitimacy. If you don't have that.
It does. And Mary and Jane was a usurper in accordance with the terms of the Act of Succession.
Interesting. Linda is just asking, I think we talked about this a bit earlier, we could talk about a bit more. Was there an unknown psychological reason why Henry was so quick to anger and dispose of people?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I think frustration made Henry what he was, as I explained earlier. And you see the king's temper getting shorter and shorter over the years. He doesn't suffer fools, and he hasn't got the patience now to put up with opposition. And as he gets older, this becomes far more pronounced.
And Linda is asking about, what is there an insight into what kind of insights do we get into Henry VIII, the private man, personal diaries, letters? I mean, there are letters.
There's loads. There's a whole wealth of letters, lots of them. State papers, recorded utterances, diplomatic calendars. There is so much for the period, and you can see so many aspects of Henry. There are also myths and legends about Henry, and you wonder how these come about, and you sort of try and find their origin and that kind of thing. He's become a part of the public consciousness, part of the mythology of England.
And Linda's also asking, what influence do you think? Any advice? We obviously know he loved her. Any advice from his mother?
I think, his mother died when Henry was, she knew Henry was going to be king. He was close to her. We know that because at this point in history, Arthur had been sent to Ludlow as Prince of Wales. He was identified with the king. He was the heir. Henry and the younger children, the sisters, were kept under the care at near London at the nursery palaces, and they were very close to their mother, who supervised their education. We know from similarities in handwriting between Elizabeth of York and Henry VIII that she probably taught him to read and write when he was very young. We don't know what advice she would have given him. It's very hard to say. She could have told him an awful lot about statecraft, having lived through
she was a very
the end of the
powerful
Wars of the
woman.
Roses. She exercised
a very intelligent woman.
Soft power.
Soft power, which obviously is the power that a queen consort gets to do, which he shows so well with Elizabeth of York.
We can't
she does
quantify it because
power.
it takes place. It operates in private.
Was that something that Anne Boleyn just couldn't do quite so well? Is exercise soft power?
No. Anne Boleyn liked being the mistress with the upper hand. And when I say the word mistress, I'm using that in the courtly sense. She was the dominant. She called the tune with Henry. As soon as they married, Henry's a conventional husband. She has to be the submissive wife. She could not.
The equivalent of into the kitchen.
Basically.
But that was not. She was shocked by that.
Yes. Well, she just didn't want. She just got so used to flexing her political muscles, and she still continued to do so in some way. Nobody was burned at the stake for heresy when Anne was queen, for example. A lot of reformist bishops were appointed to sees during her
Interesting.
tenure.
No one was burned at the stake. Why was the Boleyn? Robin was just asking here. Why was the Boleyn faction so hated at court?
Because they were perceived to be upstarts, even though they are descended. Anne's mother was a Howard. They are perceived to be upstarts, and Henry is throwing himself away on a commoner. Only one commoner has his own grandmother, Elizabeth Woodville, has married into the royal family and become queen before this in 1464. And people still feel that Henry is throwing himself away on Anne Boleyn, and that there's a huge amount of resentment at court. Factions, the Boleyn faction's very powerful, and a lot of people resent that anyway, and they're jealous.
It's a court of faction, isn't it? And if you wrote a book about a contemporary, who would you write about, says Teresa?
A contemporary? Oh my goodness. I wouldn't write about a contemporary because I would be worried about libel and slander.
You like them dead?
Quite a few centuries dead, yes, absolutely.
You wouldn't write your own memoirs? What about writing your own memoirs?
I have.
So your contemporaries yourself?
Oh yes, I'd write about myself, but I wouldn't write about, and I think I'd be not too kind, I think I'd be kind to everyone else in it.
And Glenys asks, what inspired you to become a historian? And would you describe yourself as a historian or writer of historical fiction? And is there a difference?
I would describe myself first and foremost as a historian. Writing the fiction is sort of a spin-off of that. And my mother, when I was 14, my mother marched me into a library and said, get a book. So I got this novel, very lurid jacket, Henry's Golden Queen. Can you imagine? And I devoured it.
That was the moment.
2 days, sat in an armchair and wouldn't budge. And rushed off. I went to the City of London School, I have a wonderful library, and I rushed back to the school, and this love passion was born overnight. And went off to the library to find out, did they really go on like that in those days? And trying to find out the truth, and I'm still looking for it now.
So if you had a passion for Henry VIII, but if you happened to be at Henry VIII's court, you would run a mile. You'd like, okay,
I think
I'll just make the
I wouldn't
puddings.
mind going back for a day.
And come back.
Come back.
Yes,
come back.
Not really a great place for women's health, really, isn't it? It's really fatal having a baby.
Although we all think of the high-profile things that happen there. There are many people, hundreds of people at Henry's court who lead quite normal lives. We have to get this in proportion.
Well, it's been so interesting, so fascinating. You've told us so much. You've been so generous with your time, given us so much about Henry and getting this whole life into this one fascinating book. So I'm just kind of, okay, we have a Henry VIII, the movie. Henry VIII, the movie. You and I are going to be extras. We're going to be the pudding ladies running on and off occasionally with the pudding.
Yeah, absolutely.
What kind of pudding are we going to make? What's the pudding?
Oh, Eve's pudding, apple pudding or something
we're making
he liked that. He liked pies as well.
Because Henry VIII liked to eat. So
he did like. Oh yes, he did.
Yes. So we'll bring in some puddings. What if there was a movie? Now we can't have a whole. What bit would you feel would be the section that you might
that would dramatise,
make the movie? Yeah.
I think the affair with Anne Boleyn,
yeah.
and her life with Henry and what happened at the end. It's so dramatic. This is romanticism at its in its purest form. I don't think you couldn't make it up.
And it has such an impact. I mean,
it did. It did have an impact. Absolutely.
It is. It's always so astonishing to me the impact that these personal feelings had on the lives of.
Although she
didn't
have an impact on queenship per se. She was a one-off as queen, and she certainly didn't conform to the medieval ideals of queenship. And she but because of this makes her unique. It makes her very interesting. It was very influential in her day.
Fascinating. So that's the movie. That's the section, and you are going to be the pudding lady.
I don't know about. I have to think about this.
What
I think I'd like to be something
playing?
a little slightly higher in rank.
Oh, okay. You're going to be maybe Anne Boleyn's lady in waiting.
Absolutely, yes. I might be, yes. But one of the ones who got away.
Well, thank you so much all for these fantastic questions. So many wonderful questions. I think we've managed to cover most of them. But forgive me if there's a question I haven't. I think we've talked about so much during this fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. It's been so generous of Alison to come and talk about so much. And so here's the book, Henry VIII, The Heart and the Crown, available from all the bookshops and including the Telegraph bookshop where there is a discount, I believe. And it's been a wonderful evening. It's been so fascinating. And thank you so much for joining us in such lovely weather. Thank you for coming in to join us. So I'm so grateful to Alison for talking to us and sharing so much about your research. And my just final question is, you've done Henry VIII, Alison. Can you share with us what's next, or is it a secret?
It's finished. It's Mary I, Queen of Sorrows.
Mary I, Henry's daughter.
Yep.
So that is coming next.
Next May.
We look forward to that next May, to Queen of Sorrows next May. And, enjoy the book. Do go out and get the book. And Alison, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate.